Hey everybody, happy Thursday. Just admitting a few more people into the room here. So good to see your faces. And we are live on Facebook. So welcome to part 4 of Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. Today is Desire Gone Wild with Rabbi Avi Strausberg. This program is sponsored by CSP Community Scholar Program, which is in its 20th year. And today we are dedicating this program in honor of CSP patron Beth Elster for her dedication to Jewish learning and helping to bring great programs to our community. So thank you, Beth. A few upcoming programs to note. This Sunday, May 17th, Paul Lips is back with part 3 of Creating a Nation, focusing this week on American Jews. May 19th, Yiska Smith will be talking about Jewish living as the cultivation of a spiritual practice. May 20th, Toby Kahn, Jewish artists in post-war art. May 21st, we're back again with Rabbi Avi Strausberg for part 5 of this series, Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. That one will be called Good Sex and Bad Sex. CSP Annual Fundraiser is coming up, so don't forget to support CSP. If you are not already on Ari's email list, email him at arikatz18@gmail.com. That's ARIEKATZ18@gmail.com. Also, CSP has now started a YouTube channel. It is live. I will post a link to it in the chat. Actually, I already did post it. I can post it again. So check that out and subscribe. A few words about Rav Avi, and then I will hand it over to her. So, Rav Avi Strausberg is the Director of National Learning Initiatives at Hadar and is based in Washington, D.C. She received her rabbinic ordination from Hebrew College in Boston and is a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She also holds a master's in Jewish education. Energized by engaging creatively with Jewish text, she has written several theater pieces inspired by the Torah and maintains a Daf Yomi haiku blog in which she writes daily Talmudic haikus. So during this presentation, we'll keep everyone on mute. You can interact through the chat. And with that, I will hand it over to Rav Avi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Amy. It's wonderful to be back with you. I'm so excited to continue our learning. It's very exciting to be doing this 5-part session because we really get to dig in deep to the sources and gain some momentum. I'm just going to drop the source sheet, the link to the source sheet. If you want to link to the Google Doc, I'm dropping that into the chat now so you can begin pulling that up. Okay, I'm going to put myself in gallery view, so I'm not looking at myself, but I'm looking at your beautiful faces. Okay, amazing, wonderful. Love, sex, and relationships. So this session and the next few sessions are where we get into the sex part of the class, which are some of the texts that I find sort of the most surprising, that the rabbis are talking about some of these things. And in some ways, the most exciting, that there's something I think sort of surprising and delightful and shocking to see some of the ways in which the rabbis are going to be talking about sex that we'll be seeing this week and next week. So in the 3 weeks leading up to today, we've been really focusing on the heart of relationships. We looked at sacrifice and partnership, looking at the relationship between Rabbi Akiva and his wife Rachel. How much should one give up? What's the give and take in a relationship? I looked at the difficulty of communication. How do we say what we mean? What happens when we don't say what we mean? What happens when we don't say anything at all? Specifically focusing on the very close friendship of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. And we also last week turned to looking at tochacha, giving critical and feedback, which can sometimes be difficult to do in a relationship. What happens when something goes wrong? What happens when you need to tell someone that something that they're doing is hard for you? How do you go about doing that? In friendships, in family relationships, and certainly in partnerships, how do we do that hard work of being honest? This week, we're going to be focusing on the yetzer hara, the evil inclination. Normally, when the rabbis talk about yetzer hara, it could mean a couple of different things. The general category of yetzer hara is the evil inclination, anything that makes you do things that are against Torah or things that are bad, things that take you down a bad path. But oftentimes the rabbis use yetzer hara just to sub in for talking about sexual desire, which just sort of gives you an indication right off the bat. If I were to ask you, what do the rabbis think about sexual desire? How do they feel about it? The very fact that yetzer hara, evil inclination, is the code language for the way the rabbis talk about desire should already be a little bit of an indication, how the rabbis think about it. So the questions that we're going to be looking at specifically in today's class are, we'll be looking at 2 or 3 questions. The first question I would say is, what are the rabbis' attitudes towards sexual desire? How do the rabbis think about desire? How do they talk about desire? How are we supposed to respond to it? Another question that we're going to be looking at is, we're going to look at a number of texts. And the question is, when we're looking at these texts, is what might these texts have to teach us about healthy desire and a healthy sex life? And also the flip side of that is, what might they not have to teach us? It might be that some of the things things that we encounter or confront in the text, you'll say, actually, this isn't what healthy desire, healthy sex life looks like for me. Actually, the rabbis got it all wrong here. But for me, I think what's important is to take these texts seriously and to take the rabbis seriously as they wrestle with their own feelings around desire, and to use that as a jumping off point for having honest questions and honest conversations ourselves. It might be that at the end of the day, we don't agree with some of the things that the rabbis have to say, but that we can use these to sort of hold up a mirror to our own thoughts about desire and sex, and to figure out what does a healthy sex life look like? What does healthy desire look like? I just want to say, I just want to acknowledge that these things can be difficult to talk about, talking about sexual desire and talking about a healthy sex life, sort of with any group in any context, and perhaps all the more so on Zoom, or perhaps it's even easier to have these conversations on Zoom because there's a certain distance that the chat function allows. So I just want to sort of say that we are, we're diving into exciting territory here, and I'm excited for you guys to get to see and experience these texts together. Okay, the last caveat that I want to give is, if anyone asks you, what does Jewish tradition have to say about sexual desire? Or what is Jewish tradition? If after the course you tell someone, I took this class, and someone says, what do the rabbis have to say about sex? You should say, Jewish tradition says lots of things about sex. And we'll see that even in this session, that the rabbis think many different types of contradicting things, that it's not all one note. It's not all desire is good or desire is bad, but in fact, it's complicated and nuanced. And that's what we're going to see by looking at a number of texts together. The last thing that I just want to say, just in terms of by way of how we'll use this class time, as always, this is a participatory class. I'm really excited for your questions, for your comments, for what you're bringing to these texts and how you're understanding them. So please do use the chat feature. There will be specific moments where I'll pause and say, I'll ask you a question and I'll ask you to respond in the chat. Please, please, please do so. And I'll be reading a lot of your comments out loud. If I don't read your comment, it's not because it wasn't brilliant and amazing. It's because I can only sort of skim so quickly and read so many comments, and other people are reading your comments. So even if I don't read your comment, please make your comment so other people can read it. And I'll just note, you can either comment for everyone to see or for me to see individually. If you want everyone to get to see your comment, or you want me to read out your comment out loud, just make sure you make it so everyone can see it. Comments that are sent individually to me privately, I won't read out loud because I'm not sure if you want those shared. Okay, no further ado, I'm excited to jump into the text. So I'm just going to share the text one more time. Was that link not working for people? I see. Okay, let me change the permission sharing so that you can actually get to see the text.
I also dropped in a PDF version.
Oh, good. Okay, well, that's great. Okay, I think that I might have just done it. Let's see if this works for everyone. Okay, let's try that there. Hopefully this will give you instant access. Can I get some nods if it seems like the Google link is working for people now that are trying to use the Google link? You'll let me know if it's not working. How about that? We'll do it that way. Okay, getting some nods. Amazing, great. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started with the first text. I have to say, this is one of my favorite texts. You can't start learning about what the rabbis say about sex without learning this fundamental text from the Gemara. So we're on the very first text on your source sheet from the tractate Masechet Brachot. Okay, here we go. So Rav Kahana entered and lay beneath Rav's bed. What's going on here? The student, Rav Kahana, entered into the room of his teacher secretly, and he lay beneath his bed. He heard Rav chatting and laughing and going about his needs. In the Hebrew Aramaic there, it's V'sach, he was talking, v'sachach, he was laughing, and v'asat tzarchav, he was going about his needs. This is code for what? He was having sex with his wife. Going about his needs, he was having sex with his wife, and apparently he was having a good time doing it. And Rav Kahana, lying underneath the bed of his rabbi, said, the mouth of Abba, that was a nickname for Rav, the mouth of Abba, Rav, is like one who has never eaten a cooked dish. Not only does he sneak into the bedroom of his teacher and lie under his bed while his teacher's having sex, he has the nerve to comment on it from underneath the bed and make his voice known. He should have just been quiet. So he says, the mouth of Abba is like one whom has never eaten a cooked dish. Rav said to him, Kahana, you are here? Leave. As this is, it says there, the lab orach ara. This is inappropriate. This is not the way things are done. Get out of here. And Rav Kahana says back to him, Torah hi ve'lilmod ani tzarich. He says, this is Torah, and I have to learn this. Okay, so two questions that I want to hear from you. Your response to this sort of sensational text is, what do you think that Rav Kahana means when he says, Rav is like one who has never eaten a cooked dish? How do you understand that line? And the other line that I think is particularly important is, what does Rav Kahana mean when he says, this is Torah, and I must learn it? What do you make of this text? What do you think about those two things? What does it mean? Rav is like one who has never eaten a cooked dish before. What was Rav Kahana trying to say when he said that? So just go ahead and chat that into the chat. Good. So Amy says, is this about oral sex? That, Amy, I actually hadn't thought about that, but that's certainly an interesting interpretation there. Yeah. I think he made a disapproving face. He's exuberant when he says, right, like exuberant. So like, this is like someone, he's never eaten a cooked dish before, and he's so excited. Like it's as if he's like an animal, Dominique says. It's as if Rav Kahana is saying about Rav, it's as if he's saying he's only had like raw carrots and cucumbers all of his life, and then suddenly someone presents him with warm cooked food, and Rav is like, I've never had this thing before. He's so exuberant. He's so excited. Joanne says, cooked dish, eating hungrily, enjoying sex as if it's the first time. Key word there, Joanne, enjoying, right? This is a story about Rav, the teacher, a major rabbi, has an entire school of thought, all of these students. This is a story about him sort of ravenously enjoying sex. Okay, so excited, and like you can't even wait for the food to be cooked. Ah, good, okay. Okay, so David is responding to, the Torah teaches us there's a proper way for everything, which is this is responding to Rav Kahana's line, right? So then Rav kicks him out and says, get out of here, which seems to be, I think, a very reasonable response of Rav, the teacher, to say, this is totally inappropriate, you can't be here. And again, Rav Kahana, the chutzpah of this guy, not only does he comment underneath the bed on like, wow, you seem really overly exuberant to be having sex with your wife, he then has the nerve to sort of stand his ground and say, no, this is Torah, and I need to stay here, and I need to, just in the same way that I need to learn how to separate milk from meat, and I need to learn all these different, like I need to learn how to have sex, and I'm learning that by being underneath your bed, okay? Rav Kahana meant he is having sex with a woman who is sexually experienced. Great experience, this is funny. Chris says, he seems to be saying that he's never enjoyed sex. But Chris, but at this moment he is enjoying it? I wonder about that. Right, and he wants to find out the proper way to have sex, which is to say, so it's something else that's interesting there, perhaps, is that the fact that Rav Kahana is saying this is Torah and I also need to learn it, one is to say that this is holy, like anything else, this is important and I need to learn the right way to do it, but also might mean to say that there's a wrong way to do it and I don't want to be doing it the wrong way, that there actually is a correct way to have sex and I need to learn how to do it. And in the same way that I turn to my teacher to learn all sorts of other things, I'm going to turn to my teacher to learn this. Yes, but Rav doesn't deny that it is Torah. There must be a better way to learn it, right? Or perhaps a more appropriate way to learn it from your teacher. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of sort of goes to experiential learning, that there is some learning that one might argue the way that you learn is by seeing how it's done. The way that you learn how to keep a kosher home is by, perhaps best, by being in a kosher home. So perhaps that's what Rav Kahana might argue back, is that you can't learn about sex from reading about it in a book. So he has to learn about it by being under the bed. But perhaps that's not true. Perhaps that's not the appropriate way to do it. Chris says, that's my question, whether he's a virgin or if he's not had pleasurable sex. Well, that's an interesting read on it. Do we understand Rav Kahana, do we understand Rav's excitement with having sex with his wife to mean until this moment, he's never had good sex, and in this moment, he's so excited about it? Or perhaps is their sex life always like this? Maybe what would be so amazing about Rav, and Rav Kahana is just so surprised about it, what if every time Rav was just excited about having sex with his wife? What if they just actually had a really good sex life, and Rav Kahana is taken aback by it? You know, maybe Rav Kahana has this idea of what the rabbis think about sex, or he has this notion of sex, sort of this inherited notion of sex that, well, the rabbis must not be too into it, or I have to deny something, or it's not supposed to be pleasurable. And perhaps Rav Kahana is surprised to discover that actually his rabbi seems to be enjoying sex with his wife. It's unclear what's meant by that, what that reveals about Rav and what that reveals about Rav Kahana's expectations. Okay, any final thoughts on this? What I think is just sort of so incredible about the story, a couple of things. One, I think just maybe Kahana sees sex as an obligation, not something to enjoy. Rita, of course, yeah. And so something that we'll talk about next week that we'll spend more time. This session, we're really focusing more on sexual desire. Next week, we'll be sort of focusing more on sex in general, what the rabbis think about sex, and our sort of what we think the rabbis think about sex. But yes, definitely that it could be that Rav Kahana learned quite appropriately that sex is an obligation, and he's surprised to find out that actually that perhaps desire, when appropriately expressed for one's partner, might actually be okay and a good thing. If that's the Torah that Rav Kahana takes away from this moment, that's an interesting kind of Torah. So I'd love to start off with this text, because I think I find it, there's something a little bit surprising about it, that when you think about the type of Torah that we can turn to the Torah or Mishnah or Gemara for, you don't necessarily think about, how to have sex in bed. Like, that's not the go-to. If I'm looking for sex advice, I don't think about going to the Gemara. And part of what we're seeing here is, yeah, this is Torah too. For sex to be a holy thing, it actually has to be a part of our learning and a part of our Jewish tradition, and we actually have to turn to Jewish sources to learn about it. And that's part of, perhaps inappropriately, but part of what Rav Kahana is insisting, that thinking about desire and thinking about sex as sort of awkward or taboo or sort of intimate and personal it might be, that it is also Torah, and so we have to treat it as such. We have to learn about it and actually turn to our text for it. And also, I think it's really a surprising and interesting text for seeing a major rabbi like Rav, for getting a window, Rav Kahana is giving us a window into Rav's sex life, which is, it turns out, a very good sex life, and one that's very intimate and seems to involve pleasure and seems to involve joy, which is not necessarily something we think about when we think about the rabbis talking about sex. Okay, so that is by way of intro. Let's go on to the second source. So the next source comes from the Gemara of Tractate Sukkah, the tractate that's talking about building a sukkah. And of course, sort of as in the fashion of the Gemara, oftentimes the subject of the Gemara has nothing to do with the individual text you're seeing in it, because the Gemara is so meandering and wandering. So somehow the Gemara of Tractate Sukkah that's talking about how to build a sukkah has wandered into talking about the sexual inclination. So this is what Rabbi Yochanan has to say to us. So Rabbi Yochanan says, a man has a small organ used in sexual relations. Ever katan yesh lo le'adam. If he starves the organ, it's satisfied. And if he satiates the organ, if he gives it everything it needs, then it is starving and it desires more. How do we know this? It's from Hosea. It says in Hosea, when they were fed, they became full. They were filled and their heart was exalted. Therefore, they have forgotten me. And so how is this quote being used as a proof text? It's saying this eating in Hosea is that when we eat, when we become overfull, when we sort of overindulge, that overindulgence leads us away from God and leads us to forget. And so too, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, when you overindulge in something, then you're always hungry and ravenous for more. But if you starve the thing, if you have just enough, then you become satiated. So if this is the text that we have from Rabbi Yochanan, how do you think Rabbi Yochanan relates to sexual desire? How does Rabbi Yochanan relate to sex? If this is all you had for the Jewish tradition on sexual desire and sex, what kind of picture does this paint for us? So Wendy says, absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? The sense of sort of the starving there. Something else that I think I'll just point out that I think is interesting about this text, I think a question here, and it continues to be a question, is do the rabbis differentiate when they're talking about sexual desire in men and women? Do they have a certain idea of sexual desire in men is like this and in women is like this? How does this text relate to sort of that difference in gender there? So Muriel says moderation in all things is good. Certainly that is the approach of the Rambam. The Rambam seems to say everything needs to be in balance. On one hand, sex might be a good thing, but everything has to be in balance. Peter says, starve doesn't seem to connote the right amount of moderation, but a deficiency. Right, starve is a really strong language for how we're meant to relate to sex. I mean, starve, I think, sort of says a swearing off. On the other hand, this is in tension with those other texts, which we'll actually see next week, about that we have certain obligations around sex on a regular schedule. So how does this text square with, on one hand, there are obligations around having sex on a regular basis, but on the other hand, there is this sort of fear of too much of it, too much of giving into the desire. The man will just be left wanting more and more and more. Chris says, we must keep sex in perspective with the rest of life, including our spiritual life. Women's experience isn't considered here. How does size affect the need? Yeah, so it's interesting here whether, I think that's a good point, whether women's experience isn't considered. I think this continues to be something that I think about with the rabbis, is that oftentimes I think when they think about desire, they seem to be, on one hand, oftentimes the woman is the problem, in the sense she is the one that is creating the source of the desire, but it is often men's desire that the rabbis are most concerned with. It's like there is this idea of sort of the man's inability to control the sex drive. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in Rabbi Yochanan here, is that his focus here is on the male organ and the female organ is not considered. Okay, so if we just had Rabbi Yochanan's text, whereas I think the opening with Rav and Rav Kahana suggests that in appropriate, sort of within the context of a marriage, that actually desire and laughter and joy, enjoyment can all be a part of sex. I think Rabbi Yochanan here is introducing a little bit of a, but wait a second, be careful, because too much of this is not a good thing. And in fact, quite the opposite, that there's a certain fear here of we don't want to do too much of this at all. Text suggests that one formula or protocol fits all, but people are different. Okay, good. Okay, so let's go on. I want to look at, so we're now going to see 3 different sort of major classic stories that involve different rabbis wrestling and dealing with their own inclinations towards sex, their own sex drives. So we're in the 3rd source. This is in the Tractate Kiddushin. Oh, actually, with your permission, I'm actually going to skip to the 4th source. We're going to do it out of order. So skip down to the 4th source, also from Tractate Kiddushin. It begins with the Gemara relates Rabbi Meir would ridicule. So you want the fourth source that is talking about Rabbi Meir. Okay, so the Gemara relates Rabbi Meir would ridicule transgressors. The idea here is that Rabbi Meir would make fun of people who were sexual transgressors. One day, Satan appeared to him as a woman on the other side of the river. Since there was no ferry to cross the river, he took hold of a rope bridge and crossed the river. What's the idea here? Rabbi Meir used to make fun of those people who couldn't control their own sex drives and were having sex inappropriately. He would just make fun of them. And so one day, Satan said, oh, this rabbi thinks he's above all of this. I'm going to test him. So Satan appears to him as a woman on the other side of the river. And Rabbi Meir is, of course, so overcome. As soon as he sees Satan as this beautiful woman, he starts trying to cross the river. He can't cross the river on a ferry. And so he finds a rope that he's going to be able to now, if I can't cross with the ferry, I'll get across on the rope bridge. When he reached halfway across the rope bridge, Satan left him and said to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaim about you in heaven, be careful with regard to Rabbi Meir and his Torah, I would have made your blood worth 2 mea. Which is to say, the Satan, here's a very interesting thing in terms of a window of, the rabbis have this picture of like Satan is hanging out with the angels, that they have this like relationship and they're communicating. But Satan does not like that Rabbi Meir is always making fun of these sexual transgressors and acting as though he's better than them. And so Satan says, I'm going to show him he's not above everyone else. He has the same sort of desires as everyone else. So he appears as a woman. And of course, Rabbi Meir is so overcome with desire that he starts trying to scrambling to get to Satan appearing as a woman. And then finally, sort of halfway through, Satan, disappears as a woman and says, I would have gotten you. You would have come to me. The only reason why I'm backing off is because the people up in heaven think that your Torah is really important, but you should know that you're no better than anyone else, basically. Okay? And then we're going to go on. Same thing. Rabbi Akiva would also meet Lotzetzvo Rabbi Rabbi Akiva would also ridicule transgressors, would ridicule those who were overcome by their own sexual urges. One day, Satan appeared to him as a woman at the top of a palm tree. You could see as a window into how do the rabbis think about sexual desire, how do they think about women, that there's idea, right? If the rabbis really think that at any time Satan could be masquerading as a woman, there's a sense of like a really real fear of when they are drawn into temptation by a woman, that woman could be the embodiment of Satan just trying to tempt them. So there's that fear. So Rabbi Akiva would ridicule transgressors. One day, Satan appeared to him as a woman at the top of a palm tree. Rabbi Akiva grabbed hold of the palm tree and began climbing. When he was halfway up the palm tree, he left him and said to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaim about you in heaven, be careful with regard to Rabbi Akiva and his Torah, I would have made your blood like 2 mea. And so again, sort of a similar theme here. This is like a stacking up of stories. You have these two rabbis who would make fun of other people and say, why can't you get a hold of your own sexual urges, your own sexual desires? And Satan here plays the role of, it's almost as if, on one hand, Satan is acting the part of the tempter, but it's almost as if Satan is acting the role of like, don't be so morally superior and think that you're better than everyone else. He appears as a woman, and they are able to, because of their desire, they sort of have these crazy, they go to these crazy lengths to be able to climb, how silly it is, a rabbi climbing up a palm tree, or how silly it is, a rabbi sort of crossing a river on a rope bridge, and just when they're about to get there, Satan says, I could have had you. You would have succumbed just like all the people you made fun of. I'm letting you go because of your great Torah. So if this is the text, what does this text reveal about the rabbi's perception of yetzer hara, the rabbi's perception of sexual desire? What do we take from this text? Go ahead and feel free to chat that into the chat. So Wendy writes, on one hand, that they are above it all. I would say like yes and no, right, Wendy? Because it's sort of like, it's a real cautionary story that I think it might be that the rabbis might think we're holy people, we're above it all. And actually what this text is saying is you're not above it all. It's not like the other people, the less holy people, have to worry about this thing called sexual desire, but actually all of us at any point could succumb to it. We all have to be sort of constantly on guard for the woman who is actually Satan in disguise. So Beth says, interesting that the rabbis that they choose to tell the stories about are ones whose wives we know about from the Talmud. Shows the desire is very, very great. Oh, that's interesting. So Beth, you're noting it's interesting that the rabbis pictured in these stories are the rabbis who we actually, so right, so both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, their wives are named, they're important figures, we know about them. And actually both in the case of Rabbi Meir and his wife, Broria, and Rabbi Akiva and Rachel, we know that like they're actually marriages that are held up to be really good and successful marriages. And so the fact that they are going after Satan as a woman shows how great this desire is. That's really an interesting point, Beth. And also the fact that they're coming from these sort of good, stable marriages that in the Gemara are held up to be good marriages, that might explain why at the beginning of their story, they're so quick to ridicule and mock other people. They don't realize, they're like, I'm coming from the sort of the safety of my own good marriage. And so the Satan like breaks that bubble for them. That's very interesting. So Norman says, the yetzer applies to everyone. Marion says, do as I say, not as I do. Mm-hmm. This also equates any woman who has become desired by a man. Any desirable woman is Satan. Right. So it's very interesting what this does to women in this story, that here, and that I think this is true, where I think in general the rabbis are most concerned about the sexual desire of men it's men who can't control. It's men who are climbing up trees. There are no stories, I don't think, of like women suddenly being overcome by sexual desire and climbing up the trees. The story we tell about women is that women are the Satan character. Women are the temptress. Women are the ones who get the men to do these crazy things. Self-restraint works best in theory versus in practice, right? You can have an idea of self-restraint, but it's much difficult to actually live out. Is this not also a story about hypocrisy? Yeah, so David, I think that's a question. I mean, for me, I think hypocrisy is that they say, the sort of do as I say, not as I do that Marion was saying. But I think the reason why this doesn't seem to me about hypocrisy is I think what this is a story about is how they just actually can't. I don't think this is a story where they say to everyone else, don't do it. And then they're like, oh, but I'm going to go sleep with, a woman in my spare time. I'm going to do whatever I want. I think what it's saying is that the sexual desire can really overcome anyone, and you can totally lose control. That it's like they think that they're telling other people, the self-restraint in theory versus in action, they're telling other people is just get a hold of yourself. And what they discover is that they can't even get a hold of it in their own selves. These two sects seem to be saying that sex is somehow sinful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't like the view that women are seen as temptresses and sexual objects rather than the other half of the human experience. Yeah, Chris, I hear you here. And this is why I just want to stress what I said at the beginning of the class. Don't walk away from this class, anyone, with saying like, this is the one thing that Jewish tradition has to say about sex, or the one thing has to say about women. Sort of my bottom line is, if you take anything from this, is it's complicated and nuanced, and different rabbis have a lot of different things to say. And we're going to we're going to sort of be diving more into the text on sex next week. There are certainly some views that I think see sex as sinful here. Certainly in this case, this is sex that's outside of marriage, but I think Beth's point was right. It's actually very interesting that we even know about their wives, so that the fact that you're keeping those wives in mind, it really is outside of marriage. But yes, I think that you're right here, that this is painting sort of sexual desire in a very negative light. Okay, Wendy is back to how can we see Akiva's marriage as successful? That's fair enough, right? He wasn't with her. Of course, he was desiring other people. That's very fair. Okay, I very much want to read all of your comments. Please explain why Satan doesn't out them. That's a good question, Gail. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. If we were in person, I would ask you to respond to that. I think Satan comes off looking pretty good in this story, actually. This is not like, on one hand, Satan is appearing as this like temptress woman, but I sort of get the sense that like Satan is trying to teach the rabbis that Satan is not out to ruin, like Satan could have, as the woman, I don't know, actually had sex with them and that would have really ruined their lives, or could have outed them, as you're suggesting. I think Satan is trying to teach them a lesson of don't be so morally superior and tell other people that you're better than them, that's actually what Satan is trying to teach them, and that I assume Satan actually accomplishes that. Not that Satan is trying to like ruin their lives or out them, but that's a very interesting question. Okay, I'm just going to read Joanne's comment and then we're going to move on. Maybe it is a way to teach the rabbis to have more understanding of the sexual desire of others. Then they can teach with more understanding, not condoning the uncontrolled sexual desire, but understanding their desire, and maybe they can help others better. Joanne, that's a beautiful sort of point about who do we want to be our rabbis and leaders? Do we want our rabbis to be leaders and people that are sort of perfect and above it all and sort of don't understand what the human experience is, sort of in the way that the rabbis could have acted like, oh, we rabbis don't have an issue with this thing called sexual desire, it's everyone else? Or actually, do we want to acknowledge that the rabbis, for the rabbis to really be able to pastor people and speak to people, they have to understand what it is to wrestle with their own desires, to be conflicted in themselves. So I really appreciate that, Joanne. And again, I think going with that, that does sort of paint Satan in an interesting, that what Satan is doing is actually helping the rabbis perhaps to be better rabbis so that they can actually be more compassionate and more understanding with the people that they're working with. Okay, so good. So now let's take a step back and go to text 3. So this text also comes, you'll see that actually these texts are all very close to each other on the same page in Tractate Kiddushin. So those captive women who were brought to Nehardea were brought to the house of Rav Amram the Pious. Why were they brought to Rav Amram the Pious? Because he was pious and there wasn't a concern that he would be trying to do something inappropriate with these captive women. They removed the ladder from before them. The idea here, this is the interpretation. Why did they remove the ladder? So that the other men from the school of Rav Amram couldn't climb up and try to get to these women, because they just assumed that like bringing in this group of captive women, all the men would go crazy. That's sort of the blanket assumption there. When one of them passed by, a light shone in the aperture. So when one of them would walk, so the idea is that they're in the attic, and when one of them would pass by, this like light would shine as a result of their beauty, and it would possibly drive the men crazy below. So what happened when one of them walked by and the light shined? Rav Amram grabbed a ladder that 10 men together could not lift, lifted it on his own, and began climbing. So you feel that sort of this is still the similar motif with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, that like somehow they're overcome by desire and they do these crazy things to try to attain what they're trying to attain. When Rav Amram was halfway up the ladder, this is, remember, Rav Amram the Pious, presumably they brought them to his house. But I think it's not coincidental that he's nicknamed the Pious here. When he was halfway up the ladder, again, it's halfway, that same sort of like it overtakes them, but halfway through something stops them. Either the Satan disappears or somehow something else happens. When he was halfway up the ladder, he strengthened his legs. He sort of stopped himself. He raised his voice and he said, "A fire in the house of Amram." He calls out, "There's a fire." What happens? All the sages come running because they hear Rav Amram yelling, "There's a fire." And they found him halfway up, going through the captive. So as soon as he knows that he's about to sin, he knows he's about to go to these women, and he's requesting help. And so he yells out, "There's a fire," so that everyone will come running and find him in this sort of middle position, and so that they'll help stop him. And so when the sages find him, they say to him, "You have embarrassed us," because they all know what he was about to do. And Rav Amram said to him, "It is better that you be ashamed of Amram's house in this world and not be ashamed of him in the world to come." Meaning, better that you be ashamed that I almost did something than that I actually not ask for help, I go ahead and do the thing, and then you're ashamed of me in the world to come because I actually did something inappropriate. He took an oath that his yetzer hara, the evil inclination, would emerge from him. So there's something sort of supernatural and magical happening. So he says, like, I swear that this yetzer hara, this evil inclination, is going to come out of me. And sure enough, something similar to a pillar of fire emerged from him, separate. he said to this yetzer hara, he said to this evil inclination, see, as you are fire and I am flesh, and yet I am still superior to you. And so he, on one hand, Rav Amram is overcome. He starts going up the ladder, and then halfway through, he manages to stop himself. He cries out so that everyone comes running. They all come running. And then he has this moment where he sort of forces his own yetzer hara from being inside to being outside of him. And he says, you may be made of fire, but I was still able to overcome you. Okay, how is this story similar and different to the story we just saw with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva? And again, what does this reveal about, what is the story trying to teach us about sexual desire here? So David asks, was Rav Amram in a relationship? That's a good question. We don't know that. I mean, I think it's probably fair to assume, because he was a rabbi and you assume most of the rabbis were in a relationship unless you know otherwise. Like in the case of Rabbi, there's a couple of rabbis that it's like named that they're not. So I would assume he is. Either way, I would say in a relationship or not relationship, going up and having sex with a bunch of captive women in his house was not going to be a good thing. But that is, in terms of comparing it to the Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, I'm not sure. So Wendy says he couldn't manage it on his own. He needed the others to stop him. Yeah, something that's so powerful, I think, distinguishing the Rav Amram from the Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, the whole preface to that is they would make fun of other people and they would ridicule other people and say, why can't you just get a control of yourself? Rav Amram, who actually has the title of pious, he is like, you know, even in, I'm not saying he actually is more pious than Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, but at least the text wants to tell us that he has that label of pious. It's actually Rav Amram who sort of knows to ask for help when he needs it. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, they don't sort of call out for help or say, I'm succumbing. It's actually Rav Amram who's able to sort of, in order to have the power to stop himself, he first needed to sort of own it and ask for help. So Howard says, you can't control your yetzer hara by yourself. You need social feedback, i.e. others who subscribe to the same morals and ethics. I love that. I think that that's really interesting. Howard, I think that also helps, you know, in a story that, to the extent that like some of us might be having feelings of reading these stories of, you know, the sort of the way that the rabbis are talking about sexual desire might feel sort of foreign or uncomfortable or not necessarily the way it aligns with us. I think that that's sort of the way you framed it, I think makes the text very accessible. That we have all sorts of sort of evil inclinations that lead us down inappropriate moral paths, whatever they are, and that we can't actually stop ourselves all the time from going down those paths, that we need other people who share our morals and share our values to help keep us on the right track, whatever that track is. Yeah, it's so interesting that, Rena, what you were saying. First of all, I think that there's a lot of in going on in the story about light and fire, that it's the light that comes down and it's the light coming down that causes him to run up. So there's the light there. And then he yells fire to get everyone to come. And then it actually, the yetzer hara manifests is in fire. So there's something I think there about the connection of sort of the metaphor there for desire is one of fire, that fire is something that, you know, how do you think about fire? Like, why is the yetzer hara fire? Fire is something that is burning and consumes us and is often uncontrollable. There's a chaos about fire there. David says, at least some of the rabbis must have had good self-control most of the time. So the examples might be trying to show us that we cannot assume self-control and cannot shame those who do not have self-control in one particular situation. This is more of a practical thought about how to think of people in actual legal cases. Yeah, David, that is also really interesting, that both about ourselves, just because most of the time we're able to have good self-control, we can't assume that we'll always be able to exhibit that we are all human and we might all fault from one time or the other. And that also to recognize that, to have that compassion and understanding for other people, that just because someone else makes a mistake, does something wrong, that it might be a momentary lapse in their own self-control, and that we can't shame them for it, as Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Akiva would do it. You know, part of what I think is so sort of marked about in this story is Rav Amram saying, better that you be ashamed of me now, better that I experience some amount of shame now and sort of ask for help, that I humble myself in this way, but that I be saved from it in the world to come. Okay, let's look at one more text together. I know that these are very juicy stories. I want to look at text that I think is going to give us a little bit of a different perspective. So let's look at the fifth text together. Again, this is all in the same page of Tractate Kedushin. This is the tractate that's talking about marriage agreements. So Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, again, another rabbi, was accustomed to say, whenever he would fall on his face in prayer, may the merciful one save us from the evil inclination. Harachman yatzilenu mi yetzer ara. Okay? I'm just going to take water for a second, excuse me. Okay, so he would pray. He would fall on his face every day as a part of Tachanun, as a part of the daily prayer. And he would say, save me from the evil inclination, which is not a part of set liturgy. One day, his wife heard him. She said, after all, it's been several years since he's withdrawn from me. What is the reason that he says this? So it paints talking about like marriages and the portrait. The image is Rabbi Chia is in a separate room praying, and every day he would be sort of praying and falling on his face and praying to be saved from the yetzer hara, to being saved from this inclination. And his wife is in a separate room and says, we haven't had sex in years. He's separated. The language says not we haven't had sex, it's he separated from me for years. So why is he praying this thing? What is the thing that he's struggling with? He's already separated from me. Meanwhile, this text is sort of interesting. You should remember this text next week when we talk about sort of the regularity and the obligations around sex. This text is, I think, in conversation with that. I think it sort of goes against rabbinic tradition to have a rabbi that separates from his wife for years. So what is he praying about? One day, while he was studying in the garden, she adorned herself and repeatedly walked past him. He said, who are you? She said, I am Charuta. Charuta was the name of a prostitute that's like known in the Gemara. So she says that she is this prostitute. Returning from my day, he propositioned her. She said to him, give me that pomegranate from the top of the tree. Again, so he leapt up, he went, and he brought it to her. The idea is you get that same sense of Rabbi Akiva, that he's so overcome with desire that he climbs to the top of the tree. Here he climbs to the top of the pomegranate tree and he brings it to her. And the idea here is the fact that he jumps so quickly and then brings it to her. This is metaphorically sort of connecting to the tasting the cooked dish. This is like food as metaphor for sex, that the fact that he brings it to her is sort of like code for, and they had sex. When he came home, his wife was lighting a fire in the oven. Again, connecting to the images of fire in the text before. Now we have more fire. He went and sat inside it. This is also another thing that occurs in rabbinic texts, that sometimes the characters, when they're like deeply ashamed, they'll sit inside ovens. They sit inside the fire. So she's lighting a fire, and what does he do? He just walks in and he sits inside the fire. He sits inside the oven. She said to him, what is this? What are you doing? My high, she says. He said to her, such and such thing occurred. He basically tells her what happened. She said to him, it was me. I was the one. It wasn't a prostitute. It was me. And so therefore, you didn't do anything wrong. He paid no attention to her until she gave him signs that it was actually her. She proved it. He said to her, I, in any event, intended to transgress. And so all the days of that life, all the days, the righteous man, he would fast until he died by that death. And so basically what happens, he comes home tortured. He sits in the oven. She says, what are you doing? It was me all along. I'm your wife. You haven't actually transgressed. He says, it doesn't matter. I intend to transgress. For the rest of his life, he would fast. That righteous man, the Gemara tells us, he would fast until he ultimately died of fasting. So here's my question for you. How does Rabbi Chia think about desire in this story? How does his wife relate to desire in the story? And why are the rabbis telling us this story? You have to remember that anytime the rabbis are choosing to include a story in the Gemara, they have their own agenda in telling it. So what is the rabbis who are writing the story, including the Gemara, what do the rabbis think about desire in the story? Do they approve, does the end of the story approve of Rabbi Chia's actions? What are we to make of Rabbi Chia at the end of the story? So go for it in the chat. Right, so I think certainly from Rabbi Chia's perspective, desire is a bad thing. He's very worried about his own desire. I mean, it's interesting, you still don't really know when he's praying to be saved from the evil inclination, you still don't really know what that's about. Is he worried about sleeping the desire for his own wife? Is he worried about when he'll be sleeping with his wife, he'll be thinking about someone else? It's still not even really, what you know is that he's not having sex with his wife, and it's not clear what he's so afraid of. So Gail says that adultery is unacceptable and rabbis can even transgress. So part of the through line that we're seeing here of these stories is rabbis are people too, and rabbis can also transgress. That this is hard for everyone. Beth says Rabbi Chia thinks desire is all about intention. His wife thinks it's about actions. Okay, so David and Rena, I want to take your comments together. David says they seem to be making fun of him for being such a prude. Rena says he has been depriving his wife and she wants to see if he is really incapacitated. His wife thinks that desire is normal, accepted. Right, so I think part of what's sort of really striking about the story, part of why I bring it is, the story, I think certainly Rabbi Chia is sort of continuing with the sort of narrative of desire, that all desire is bad, whether it's certainly the desire that pursuing this prostitute, or possibly even the desire for his own wife, since he's separated from his wife and hasn't been having sex with. Certainly I think Rabbi Chia's associations around sex do not seem to be particularly sex positive. It's interesting, Peter is saying he starves himself. So this connects back to our very first text with Rabbi Yochanan, that he says the way to deal with the male organ is to starve it. So there's a literally starving here. He's starving himself from sex at the beginning, and then he's starving himself from food at the end. So I think Rabbi Chia seems to have those notions of sex as something to be feared, or sexual desire, something to be stayed away from. But at the same time, he's depriving his wife. He has certain obligations to his wife. And there's the picture of their marriage is his wife has to overhear his prayer from the other room, that they're not in the same room. He's in the garden and she's somewhere else, sort of the disconnection there. And I think that there's sort of a presumption there that perhaps she wants to be intimate with her husband and he's separated all these years. I think that the coda at the end of the story, I think that if you didn't have that, all the days of that life, the righteous man would fast until he died by death, you might think that this story is just sort of confirming all that we've learned about desire up until now. It's desire, something to be feared, is something bad. I think that the fact at the end of the day, he starves himself until he dies, to me, it does. I don't know if I would go so far as David, that they're making fun of him, but I think it does suggest that actually Rabbi Chia might have gone too far. And perhaps the way he's responding to desire, separating from his wife, sitting in the oven, fasting himself, that he's responding to desire in a way that's not healthy. And they're saying, actually, this starving yourself for the sake of the starving that Rabbi Yochanan suggested at the beginning, to starve yourself, the literal starving of yourself to the fact that it causes your own death, that's not what we want either. So sort of the people who are suggesting in the beginning that there has to be some sort of moderation and balance, I think that Rabbi Chia is not succeeding in finding that balance here, that he has to pull back from sort of those feelings around desire. Okay, I want to just take a moment to look at some of your comments. Dr. Ruth would diagnose this as a pathology. Only dirty sex is desired by the rabbi. Yeah. So that's interesting. So Rena's noting that he is the one who actually submitted to the temptation. We have all these stories of the rabbis almost, but it's actually him. Meanwhile, it's interesting that even in the one that it's actually him, it's still not really spelled out explicitly what happens there. Okay, I want to, in our last 5 minutes, we have to see one more very important text together to sort of bring this all together and complicate our notion of desire. So look at this last text. This comes from a collection of interpretations on the book of Genesis, specifically on the beginning of creation, of God creating man. So this is our last text in Genesis Rabbah. So Rabbi Nachman Bar Shmuel Bar Nachman, said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman. That's sort of amazing. All the Rab Nachman Shmuels, this is like in the rabbinic world, you're either a Shmuel or a Nachman or the son of a Shmuel or a Nachman. Anyway, so Rabbi Nachman Bar Shmuel said, behold, it is very good. When the Torah says, Hine Tov Me'od, it says in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 31, it says, God says, after God creates man and creates animals, God says, Hine Tov Me'od. So Rav Nachman Bar Shmuel says, Hine Tov Me'od ze yetzer hatov. When God says, Hine Tov Me'od, it was very good, this is referring to the good inclination. Ve'hine Tov Me'od ze yetzer hara. And also when God says, and behold, it was very good, God was simultaneously referring to the evil inclination. So he's saying something radical. He's saying that when God looks around and blesses the world and says, this is all very good, God is referring both to the creation of the yetzer hatov, the good inclination, the inclination to do good in the world, and the yetzer hara, the inclination to do bad in the world. But the things to do bad in the world is also blessed as hine tov me'od, it is very good. And then the text says, v'chi yetzer hara tov me'od et maha. And could it be that the evil inclination is something good in the world? That's shocking. That's a wonder. Ela she'ilu le'yetzer hara. Rather, if it hadn't been for the creation of the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, lo bana adam bayit, a person would never build a house. Velo nasa isha, they would never take a wife. Velo holid, they would never have a kid. Velo nasa, velo natan, and would never give and would never take in business. Right, so what he's saying is, were it not for the evil inclination actually brings us a lot of good in the world. The desire to sort of, to whatever that is, the sort of the lust of the evil inclination, the greed of the evil inclination, whatever that sort of that thing that's propelling the yetzer hara forward, it doesn't always lead to bad, actually leads to a lot of good. It's that desire and ambition and that drive and that lust that can lead to bad results, but also leads to a lot of good results, like building a house, getting married, having kids, doing business. All of this is also a result of the yetzer hara. And that is why the yetzer hatov, the good inclination, and the yetzer hara are both blessed as hine tov me'od, behold, it was very good. And how do we know this? He quotes the book of Ecclesiastes that it says there, Shlomo says, and I have also noted that all labor and skillful enterprise come from men's envy of each other. Which is to say that men's envy, you would think that envy, that desire, right? It says in the Torah, it says in the Ten Commandments, don't envy, don't covet. You would think that that would be a bad thing, but actually that it's a result of coveting that creates the desire and drive of ambition that creates so much productivity. So I leave this text with you just to sort of recomplicate the picture. I think that some of the ways that the rabbis talk about sexual desire is really sexual desire is something to be feared. I think that whoever made that comment, I think it was Chris, that they were sort of uncomfortable with the way sex was being talked about and also uncomfortable with the way women were being portrayed as a Satan. I think that is definitely there in rabbinic texts, sort of that concern that we can be overcome. I think a lot of that is placed on men, but it's also much more complicated than that because you have that opening text from Rav in which Rav clearly desires his wife and sex is pleasurable and enjoyable. And you have this text from Bereshit Rabbah, which is saying, actually, yetzer hara, the evil inclination, is not all evil because actually it leads us to a lot of good sometimes. And so I think this comes back to what other people were saying is, I think what we're seeing here, it's a question of moderation and it's a question of when and in what places. And what I love so much about the Rav Amram text, the one with the captives, is that he's modeling what it means to be human. That even Rav Amram, the pious, he knows that he's not above it all. He knows that he too is subject to his own desires, and he knows when to ask for help. And sort of as someone so eloquently said, in order to stay on a good path, we need to be surrounded by other people to help us enforce what those important moral values are, whatever they are. So thank you for joining in. I'm looking forward to next week where we'll really be getting more into the ins and outs of what do the rabbis think, what is good sex, what is bad sex, and what does a holy sex life look like?
Thank you so much, Rav Avi. That was amazing. I'm loving this series. And thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder, we'll be back on Sunday with Paul Lips And next week, Tuesday with Yiska Smith, Wednesday with Toby Khan, and Thursday back again with Rabbi Avi. So with that, thank you everyone. Have a great day and see you soon.